Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I begin in the name of God, most beneficent, most merciful, and I bring you a greeting from my tradition. Salam alaikum, may peace be upon all of you. It is, thank you. It is a great honor and a pleasure to be here. I guess I was so delighted by the event last night, and that the Lord must have heard me, so I may be staying here longer than I thought. They say be careful what you ask for. So I want to share with you something which you may not be quite aware of. You know, Islam and Muslims, before 9/11, Islam was an exotic faith. These were people who were out there. And I think generally people in North America didn't really know much. And then 9/11 happened, and everybody became an expert on Islam and Muslims, and CNN and Fox News became the seminary from which people were being taught about Islam. I would say if you want to know anything about Islam and Muslims, please don't use CNN and Fox as the basis foundation of your learning. So what I'm here to share with you is a different narrative, is a different piece. Let me begin by telling you that I'm a Pakistani by birth, I am a Canadian by choice, and Islam is my spiritual journey. And I use the word spiritual intentionally because it's important to clarify right at the top that faith is not politics, and politics is not faith. And this, my friends, is the critical difference between political Islam, which we see today, and the spiritual message of my faith, which has been stolen blatantly and brazenly and replaced by a violent ideology. So what is the spiritual message of the faith? And this is what I will share with you in the short time we have together. Islam at its core is the affirmation and belief in one God. Islam's holy text, the Quran, repeatedly reminds Muslims and others who may read it that Islam is not a new religion, but the elemental faith of man, of humanity, the belief and witness to the reality of one God as the source and origin of all things in the universe. This primal faith gets repeatedly corrupted, yet God sends prophets and messengers to reform the corrupted faith and remind people how their sorrow in this world is a product of their corruption, born as they deliberately or mistakenly wander away from the path that was prescribed. Dr. Karen Armstrong, who is a theologian and has written extensively about this, about faith, she speaks to this conundrum in faith. And she says that each faith tradition represents a constant dialogue between a timeless, transcendent, or sacred reality and the constantly changing circumstances of life here on earth. We all have to struggle to make our scriptures and the insights of our tradition to speak to the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. So Islam is a reminder to each and every soul endowed with free will of its connection to God, of its responsibility and accountability on the day of reckoning, of the relationship of God and man in the divine scheme of things. Those who acknowledge this cosmological reality and submit to it, living out of obedience, faith, love, devotion, however one wants to explain the meaning of submission, which is one of the meanings of the word Islam in Arabic. That person is then at peace within, while the outward reality of such a person would reflect God's mercy and compassion. Now, on our board of directors for Muslims Facing Tomorrow, we have a wonderful historian by the name of Professor Salim Mansour, and I'm going to quote him when he says eloquently, "The outward turmoil in an individual or a nation is the absence of spirituality, inner peace, and harmony, and nothing better reveals the wisdom of this message than the present state of Muslims and their nations so utterly in disrepair, indicating how greatly absent is God's spiritual message as delivered to Muhammad from their lives." As for Muhammad, the messenger of God who brought the message of Islam, he is perhaps best described and understood through the lens of non-Muslim scholars. So I won't go into details about his life, but if you're interested, the two books that I highly recommend are one by Deepak Chopra, who is the yoga guru and has written about many different faiths. It's a book called Muhammad. And the other one is by Leslie Hazelton, who has written a book called The First Muslim. And she is a secular Jew and calls herself an accidental theologian. It's a term that I just love. So briefly, at age 40, Muhammad had a profound spiritual experience when he was visited by the angel Gabriel, and it was his spirituality that inspired the people around him. Now, when the Quran was revealed as a message to Muhammad, he was living in a society that was very pluralistic. So the Quran addresses diversity, calling it a blessing from the Creator. For your information, the word Quran means the reading. And it's not just a book of laws, but it's more a moral and ethical guide with some beautifully spiritual, uplifting passages, if only we had the time to understand them. And I'm going to just recite to you the translation of a verse, chapter 24, verse 35, which is my favorite verse in the Quran, and it is called the light. And it reads, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The simile of God's light is like a niche in which there is a lamp, the lamp in a globe of glass, the globe of glass as it were a shining star lit from a blessed olive tree, neither of the east nor of the west, its light nearly luminous, even if fire did not touch it, light upon light. The Quran also clearly elucidates that this is not a standalone message, but has to be practiced in conjunction with the teachings and messages that came before it, which is Judaism and Christianity being the closest in the Abrahamic monotheistic faiths. Now, the striking fact upon first reading of the Quran is how much of its message is Jewish and Christian. The Quran tells the story of the Jews, of Abraham, of Moses, of Jesus and Mary, among many others. And there is an entire chapter in the Quran titled Maryam, or Mary, which tells the story of the virgin birth. Now, when I tell people in churches about this, they're absolutely astonished, because many Muslims also don't know that Jesus is mentioned more times by name in the Quran than Muhammad. It's also remarkable how Muslims, despite their daily readings of the Quran, tend to obscure this fact that we send blessings on the progeny of Abraham 5 times a day in our daily prayers. If Muslims were to sincerely and truly follow the spiritual message of Islam, they would understand how much Jesus is revered, and perhaps the persecution of Christians in Muslim lands would cease. In the chapter on women, An-Nisa, verse 171, we read, "Indeed, the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, is the messenger of God. His word revealed on Mary, and a spirit sent from him." Jesus, or Isa in Arabic, is deemed by Islam to be a prophet. He is referred to by name in 25 different verses of the Quran, and 6 times with the title Messiah or Christ, depending on which Quranic translation is being used. He is also referred to as the messenger and the prophet, but perhaps above all else as the Word and the Spirit of God. Interestingly, no other prophet in the Quran, not even Muhammad, is given this particular honor. In fact, among the 124,000 prophets said to be recognized by Islam, a figure that includes all the Jewish prophets of the Old Testament, Jesus is considered second only to Muhammad and is believed to be the precursor of the Prophet of Islam. Now, according to Islamic theology, Christ did not bring a new revealed law or reform of an earlier law, but introduced what is known as a tariqah, or a new path based on the love of God. And it is perhaps for this reason that he is adopted very closely by the mystics of Islam, or the Sufis. And I'm going to speak here of Sufism because it's very, very close to my heart, and we consider this the necessary antidote to the violence that is assailing the Muslim world today. Briefly, Sufism is a movement that arose within Islam in the 8th and 9th centuries as an ascetic movement, Its followers seek to find divine truth and love through direct encounters with God. Sufism developed religious practices focused on strict self-control that enable both psychological and mystical insights, as well as loss of self or loss of the ego, with the ultimate goal of mystical union with God. Sufism's philosophical principles and ritual practices include writing and reciting poetry and hymns. Some of the most famous and beautiful literature of the Islamic world has been written by Sufis. The most well-known Sufi, the best-read poet in the world, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, known as Rumi in the Western world. Now, the great Sufi philosopher Al-Ghazali described Jesus as the prophet of the soul, and the Sufi master Ibn Arabi called him the seal of the saints. The Jesus of Islamic Sufism is a figure not easily distinguished from the Jesus of the Gospels. But the problem lies here with those who focus only on certain aspects of the faith with selective readings out of context. For example, I want to address with you here today the term jihad, which has become the most abused and misused of the Islamic concepts, because there is a spiritual component to this term which has been totally sidelined. Now, there is a tradition of Prophet Muhammad that declares that the supreme jihad is against oneself, that is, against one's ego, greed, and insatiable desires. Jihad can also, for example, be aimed at social development of a community. It can also be an intellectual jihad, directed against oppressive and totalitarian thought or towards an intellectual uplifting of society. Lastly, jihad can also take on the form of a physical struggle against oppression and aggression, but it has to be done under very specific conditions and only in self-defense. Jihad is therefore more than simply holy war. In fact, the word holy war is never used in the Quran. It is a defensive war which places certain responsibilities on those who are called to engage in it. And as a moral exercise, jihad may only be performed strictly under the Islamic rules of engagement. And this means that innocent individuals, women, children, and unarmed civilians cannot be harmed. Property and places of worship of other faiths cannot be demolished. So kidnappings, hostage-taking, suicide bombings, indiscriminate shooting of civilians, placing bombs in areas and buildings where people work are evil deeds that Islam totally condemns. This is black and white, there is no gray area here. So what I've described to you is a look at the spiritual message of Islam, which is why when people ask me why I am still a Muslim, the answer is because I live my life by the spiritual message of Islam. But now I'm going to address what you see around today and why the spiritual message has morphed into political Islam, which we call Islamism. And I'll make that distinction between Islam as a spiritual faith and a spiritual message, and Islamism, which is political Islam and is devoid of any spirituality. So the question that is on people's minds, and I will say it here, is that how did a message of peace become a force that led to the death and destruction at 9/11 and the turmoil that we see within the Muslim world today? And the answer is that the message was distorted for political means and by political actors. Today, many Muslims have sidelined the spiritual message of Islam, the connections to the Abrahamic faiths, and have turned Islam into a political ideology that is exclusionary and violent. Instead of educating the masses and children and people in the Muslim world about the historical heritage of the faith, there is a dire need to blame someone for all the ills facing humanity. So these are people who thrive on conspiracy theories, on a victim ideology, because this helps them deflect the real issues that are facing us. So Muslims are buried in a deep, dark abyss of their own making. And the only way we can crawl out is to accept the truth. And the truth, my friends, as you know, is not always easy. But I see us with no other choice. We can sweep the problem of radical Islam under the carpet, but it will emerge again and again like the head of a snake. Similarly, the so-called war against terrorism hasn't worked because it's impossible to wage a war against an ideology unless we engage and empower the people who can make a difference in retrieving the spiritual message of the faith and working towards a reform or a renaissance, which is much needed in the Muslim world today. And much of this is vested in political Islam, which is an aberrant strain of Muslim thinking that can be traced back in Arab Muslim history to the early years of Islam. The defining characteristic of Islamism is its intolerance towards others, including Muslims, and glorification of violence against those who disagree. The conflict inside the Muslim world might be characterized as one between tyranny on one side and freedom of the other, even though the tyranny is packaged in God's name. High among the issues of conflict some 1400 years ago was the issue of secession. Following Muhammad's death, his successors, administering the quasi-state the Prophet established in Medina, were torn among themselves by blood-soaked internal tribal quarrels resulting from familial ambitions and interests of ruling. They directed military campaigns which eventually extended the boundaries of Islam beyond the Arabian heartland into North Africa and Asia. What happened during those years reads like a political and criminal novel, with even Muhammad's wives involved in the intrigue and the political turmoil that was unfolding. And this period of inner turmoil, too involved to go into detail here, is called the period of al-fitna, or mischief-making. And it reads like a reality show. And if you thought The Sopranos was complicated, just try reading the history of early Islam. There were other issues also that led to much of the turmoil. There were issues of women's rights, tribal rivalry, and very importantly for Muslims today, the compilation of the Quran. When I speak to audiences, many non-Muslims ask me if I can recommend a Quran for them to read, and I say no. And they're shocked when I say no. The Quran is not an easy book to understand, even for Muslims. And the reason is that it was compiled many years after the death of the Prophet, who had actually received the revelation as an oral tradition, and it was later compiled into book form by the rulers who ruled after the Prophet. And for some reason, in their own wisdom, they compiled it from the longest verses to the shortest, so it's not in chronological order. It's like reading a book from the middle, going to the end, and then to the beginning. So it's very confusing. It contradicts itself at places, and it has to be read and understood in historical context. So there are books that actually help you read and understand the Quran. This is why our extremists and our fundamentalists and our terrorists are able to take a line out of context and quote it and use it as their justification for violence without understanding the historical context under which this was sent. And the messages of the Quran were sent over a period of 23 years for a specific time and a place and an occasion. Reflecting on recent events, you may know that Osama bin Laden was a Saudi citizen, a multimillionaire, and a fanatic adherent of the Wahhabi creed, which is the ideology that comes from Saudi Arabia, which is violent and which is now invading our mosques and our places of worship. It is, and of course, Saudi petrodollars have facilitated the spread of Wahhabism globally. It's estimated that over $70 billion. I want you to focus on the figure. $70 billion have been doled out by the Saudi government and agencies and private citizens in funding mosque constructions across the Muslim world and in North America, and in financing Muslim organizations and youth clubs that spread this Islamist ideology. So it's actually a factory that manufactures this violent ideology. It's like a business, with the public relations being funded by these multi-billion dollars that we can never even deal with. I mean, 2 pensioners trying to deal with this massive, massive funding and ideology. So the historic divide within Islam is between the majority Sunnis. There are actually 72 denominations within Islam. The largest one is the Sunnis, and the minority Shias, and it is which are estimated to be less than 15% of the world's Muslim population of 1.6 billion Muslims. But this division is also fueled by the extremists to divide and rule. And if you go back to the history of the world, you'll know that this is something that has been used by leaders all the time. So essentially, we have allowed the extremist voices to run rampant. I don't want to leave you with just doom and gloom, so let me tell you that there are solutions. Many Muslims today see the spiritual tradition as the potential answer to the extremism that has hijacked the faith. Because some of the greatest reform movements in the 19th century were carried out by the Sufis, by the mystics, by the spiritualists. There are no detailed statistics about the numbers of Sufis that practice today because they have been also persecuted and have gone underground. And both Shias and Sunnis may also be Sufis. But we feel that the strategically right thing to do is to provide moral and material assistance to Muslims struggling against this ideology. The war is within the world of Islam, and you are suffering the lashback from it, but you can help, by you I mean people who are not Muslim, by supporting those voices that are speaking out within this war. We are the frontline warriors, but we need the support. And the emphasis of the West in defeating political Islam should be the same as that which was applied to defeating communism and fascism. But we have a problem when your president can't even use the word Islamist terrorism in the same sentence. So the battle for the soul of Islam is being fought as we speak by brave men and women, unafraid of the backlash, and there is a huge backlash. There are death threats, there are fatwas, there is hate mail. You know, it's very sad when you have to have a folder in your internet called hate mail, but unfortunately that is the reality. And I should share with you just before leaving that my name is on a list of the 10 most hated people in the Muslim world. I'm number 6, but I plan to be number 1. Thank you very much.
Your response indicates that I don't have to thank Raheel, but I want to do it in any case. Thank you, Raheel. You exposed, I think, my ignorance as well in conversations throughout your visit here. We have so much to learn, and that was one of the purposes that I invited you to come to us. Thank you for that. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for your wisdom.
My pleasure.